equity as principle and practice. Social equity involves measurable resources being distributed in such a way that everyone has exactly what they need to thrive. You may have heard of equity in the context of selling and buying stocks of a company, but here we're actually talking about the distribution of the resources people need to thrive. By thrive, we mean to grow or develop well, to prosper or flourish. Another way of thinking thrive is that people have the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution, meaning that they can be a part of, they can have a sense of purpose in what's going on in the world, and they have a sense of belonging, right? They feel like they're safe, like we talked about with justice, and of course they have enough health, enough well-being to be able to do that. And you can learn a lot about the social determinants of health that can very much affect how people's physical health and mental health are impacted by social factors. When we talk about resources, we're talking about ownership, access, power, support, wealth, and others, right? Who actually own these things, whether it be land or food or the means of production, or it might be ideas, right? Who gets to kind of claim ownership of certain ideas? Who gets to profit off of the ownership of certain ideas? We can see many cases, for example, of one person coming up with something, someone else profiting off of it, and the person who created it doesn't necessarily get any of those benefits. Who has access to certain things? Sometimes access is hindered literally, right? If we were talking about explicit biases of, this is the colored people water fountain and this is the white people water fountain. But more often, there are more subtle, more unconscious biases that are happening that are affecting people's ability to access certain resources, as well as to be able to have the wealth that they might need to be able to do what they want to do. One important distinction is that equality means everyone gets the same, and equity is attuning to the unique needs of different people. This image, I think, really simply illustrates the distinction between equality and equity. As you can see in the equality image, everyone's getting the same support. Everyone's getting the same booster, right? But because people have different starting points, people have different needs, that same support might not work for everyone. In this instance, the person on the left doesn't even need a booster. They've already got all the height that they need. The person in the middle needs two, and the person on the right, they actually don't need a box, they need a ramp because they're in a wheelchair. So equity really asks the question of what does each person need based off of the resources that we have. Cultivating equity. These are steps that we can take, and once again, they're not necessarily going to be linear. But the first one is to learn what each person in the group needs to thrive, right? Different people in the group might need different things, so you might just start by asking. You might start to ask the question of what does it look like for members of our team to thrive? What would it look like for members of this community to be thriving? You might research, you might interview people, but you want to understand what does it mean to thrive for each individual and what does that person need in order to thrive. This is very important, of course, for an organization because thriving teammates, thriving members make a thriving organization. If people are not able to feel a sense of real contribution, it's unlikely they're going to be able to perform as well. You always have to take account of the historical and systemic factors that have resulted in the current inequities. For example, certain resources may have been distributed in such a way in the past that some can thrive now and others cannot. One way to think about it is that we were all born into a building, and this building was designed in the 1600s by people who had very likely extremely different values and experiences than you have today. These folks were all slave-owning, very wealthy, power-holding white men who just lived in a completely different context and often didn't care about the lives of women, black people, children, or at least not to the level that they cared about their own. So even though we don't necessarily still believe the same things that they believe. If we're running the building today, if we're organizing that building, we have to recognize that the systems that this building was designed in and the systems that it holds, the very design of the building, are all still holding that legacy. So how can we account for historical and systemic factors that have resulted in the current inequity? Rearranging or creating new systems for increasing equity, right? Now we are recognizing what does it mean to thrive, what people need. So we look at, well, what do we have, and how can we rearrange these things in such a way that everyone can have their best shot? You can always ask yourself, can we start with those who have the greatest need? As you saw in the image, it wouldn't have made the most sense to start with the tallest person who can already see the game pretty well. So it might make the most sense to start with someone who has the most need for support, or the people who have the most need for support. Furthermore, if you have more than you need, are you willing to be generous? It's just as important for us to be focusing not only on who does and doesn't have access, but also who has something to share, right? Many people in our world today have more than they need to be able to thrive, while even more people have less than they need. But in many, many cases, we can see that there's plenty of resource. It's just not distributed in such a way that everyone has what they need. Often, if we look inside of our organizations and inside of our teams, we'll see that there's a lot more resources available to us than we think. And it's important for us to have a creative rather than a scarcity mindset when we do this, because sometimes certain people are thriving and they get to have the chance to support others. And they might actually get so much enjoyment from supporting others, from being useful and helpful, that it almost feels like there's more resource available than there was before. What I'd like you to do now is think about your situation. Think about the instance that you came up with as a practice scenario. What would it look like to be practicing these steps of equity here? How could you look at the people involved in the situation and ask, what might it mean for these people to thrive? Or in other words, what do these people need? What do these people really want? What would really help this person or these folks succeed, to thrive, to be well? And do we have that? How can we redistribute that? Who has plenty? Are there folks on the team who might have a little bit of more support that they can help with? Or are there resources that we have that we can distribute differently? So start to get creative. It's almost like having Legos and rearranging those Legos in a different way such that you can create the most useful design.